My name is Marcus Thompson, I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 12 years of my life as a long-haul trucker crossing state lines from my home base in Phoenix, Arizona to every corner of this country. The job kept me on the road for weeks at a time, sleeping in truck stops, eating diner food, and counting down the miles until I could see my wife Rebecca's face again. I thought we had built something solid together. A ranch-style house in Scottsdale with desert landscaping out front, a red Chevy Silverado in the driveway, and weekend barbecues under the Arizona sun. For 8 years of marriage, I believed we were unbreakable, until the night she called me from a hospital bed in Phoenix, her voice trembling as she told me our baby was coming 3 weeks early, and I needed to get home immediately to sign the birth certificate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The call came through my CB radio at 2 a.m. while I was parked at a truck stop outside Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'd been hauling electronics from California to Dallas, a regular route that usually took me 4 days round trip. Rebecca's voice was shaky, urgent, cutting through the static. "Marcus, you need to come home right now, the baby's coming. I'm at Banner Good Samaritan. They say she could arrive within hours." My heart hammered against my ribs as I threw my logbook aside and fired up the engine. 3 weeks early wasn't supposed to happen. Rebecca had been having a smooth pregnancy, or so I thought. Every phone call from the road, every text message, she'd assured me everything was perfect. The nursery was ready, painted in soft lavender with white furniture I'd helped assemble during my last weekend home. We'd chosen the name Emma for our daughter, and Rebecca had already bought tiny dresses that hung in the closet like promises of the future. During that 5-hour drive through the desert darkness, my mind raced through every conversation we'd had over the past months. Rebecca worked as a dental hygienist at a practice in downtown Phoenix, and she'd mentioned picking up extra shifts while I was on the road. "Just trying to save up for when Emma arrives," she'd said. "Dr. Nathan thinks I'm one of the most reliable employees he's ever had." I trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? After 8 years of marriage, she'd never given me a reason to doubt her. When I was home, she'd curl up next to me on the couch, her head on my shoulder, talking about baby names and nursery themes. She seemed genuinely excited about becoming a mother, about building our family. I thought her dedication to work was just another sign of how responsible she was, how much she cared about providing for our future. The Arizona highways stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky as I pushed my rig harder than I should have, desperate to make it to Phoenix before our daughter arrived. I called Rebecca twice during the drive, but both times it went straight to voicemail. The first message I left was calm, reassuring. "Hey babe, I'm about 3 hours out, hold tight, I'll be there soon." The second call, an hour later, carried more edge. "Rebecca, pick up your phone, I need to know what's happening." The silence on the other end made my chest tight with worry. Maybe she was in labor, unable to answer. Maybe the phone was dead. I told myself there were a dozen reasonable explanations, but doubt crept in like smoke under a door. When I finally pulled into the hospital parking lot at Banner Good Samaritan, dawn was breaking over the Phoenix mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I left my truck in the visitor lot, and ran through the automatic doors, still wearing my flannel shirt and jeans that smelled like diesel and road dust. The maternity ward was on the 4th floor, and the elevator ride felt like it took forever. My hands shook as I pressed the button, anticipating holding my daughter for the first time, imagining Rebecca's tired but happy smile. I'd missed too many moments because of my job, too many anniversaries and birthdays cut short by delivery schedules. But I wasn't going to miss this. Nothing could have prepared me for what I found when I walked into room 412. Rebecca was propped up in the hospital bed, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face looked pale under the fluorescent lights. Standing beside her bed was her mother, Linda, a sharp-featured woman in her 60s, who had never quite approved of me or my job. On the other side of the bed stood Dr. Nathan Pierce, Rebecca's boss from the dental practice. He was a tall man in his early 40s with graying temples and an expensive watch that caught the light as he gestured. The scene should have been beautiful, the moment I'd been dreaming about for months. Instead, something felt wrong. The way Dr. Pierce's hand rested on the back of Rebecca's chair, the way Linda's eyes avoided mine when I walked in, the way Rebecca's smile seemed forced nervous. Dr. Pierce was the first to speak, extending his hand toward me with professional courtesy. "Marcus, congratulations. Rebecca's been incredible throughout this whole process. You should be very proud." His grip was firm, confident, the handshake of a man accustomed to being respected. I thanked him, but something in his tone bothered me. He spoke like he'd been there for more than just professional support, like he'd been part of this journey in ways I hadn't been. Rebecca finally looked up at me, her eyes bright but somehow guarded. "Marcus, meet Emma, she's perfect." She lifted the baby slightly, and I saw a tiny face with dark hair and features that were hard to make out in the bundle of blankets. My chest swelled with pride and love, but underneath it, a nagging feeling persisted. Something about the timing, about Dr. Pierce's presence, about the way everyone in the room seemed to be performing rather than celebrating. Linda stepped forward, her voice carrying that familiar edge of disapproval she reserved for me. "The birth certificate needs to be signed, Marcus. The hospital needs it completed before you can take Emma home." She gestured toward a clipboard on the bedside table, where official-looking documents waited with several blank lines. "Rebecca's exhausted from the delivery. The least you can do is handle the paperwork." I picked up the clipboard, scanning the forms. My name was already filled in as the father, typed neatly in black ink. All that was left was my signature, a simple scrawl that would legally bind me to this child for the next 18 years. Something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way Dr. Pierce lingered by Rebecca's bedside instead of leaving like any normal doctor would. Maybe it was the way Rebecca couldn't quite meet my eyes. Maybe it was just the paranoia that comes from spending too many lonely nights on the road, wondering what happens at home while you're gone. I set the clipboard back down on the table, and looked directly at Rebecca. "How early did you say Emma came?" My voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that made the room go quiet. Rebecca's face flushed slightly. 3 weeks early, like I told you on the phone. Sometimes babies come when they're ready." Dr. Pierce nodded, his professional demeanor intact. "Premature births aren't uncommon. Emma appears to be perfectly healthy despite the early arrival." Linda crossed her arms, her expression defensive. "What are you getting at, Marcus? Sign the papers so we can all go home." But I wasn't ready to sign anything yet. 8 years of marriage had taught me to read Rebecca's tells, the little signs that appeared when she was hiding something. The way she bit her lower lip when she was nervous. The way she avoided eye contact when she wasn't telling the complete truth. All those signs were flashing now like warning lights on my dashboard. I pulled out my phone and opened the calendar app, scrolling back through the dates. "Let me just double-check something," I said, my voice steady. "According to my logbook, I was home exactly 9 months and 2 weeks ago. That was the weekend we went to Sedona. Remember? We stayed at that bed and breakfast with the Red Rocks view." Rebecca's face went pale. "Marcus, what are you doing? Why are you making this complicated?" But I continued scrolling, cross-referencing my delivery schedules with the timeline. If Emma came 3 weeks early, that would put conception right around that Sedona weekend. But if she came on time, well, that changes things considerably. The math was simple, brutal in its clarity. Dr. Pierce cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, I think you're overanalyzing this. Due dates are estimates. Babies arrive when they're ready." The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. Linda's face had hardened into a mask of indignation. "Marcus, you're being ridiculous. Sign the papers and stop embarrassing your wife." But Rebecca wasn't defending herself anymore. She was staring down at Emma, rocking slightly, her silence more telling than any words. I looked around the room at the three of them, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I noticed details that hadn't registered before. Fresh flowers on the windowsill that weren't from me. A gift bag with expensive baby clothes that I hadn't bought. A card propped up on the side table signed with love. And I walked over and picked up the card, studying the handwriting. It was masculine, confident, the same style I'd seen on prescriptions and medical notes. Dr. Nathan Pierce's signature was unmistakable. "Nathan," I said, holding up the card. "Since when do you call Dr. Pierce by his first name, Rebecca?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she still couldn't look at me directly. "He's been very supportive during the pregnancy, Marcus. He's a friend." Linda stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Dr. Pierce has been wonderful to Rebecca, while you've been gallivanting across the country. Someone needed to be here for her." But something in Linda's tone suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Dr. Pierce straightened his tie, his professional composure slipping slightly. "I should probably give you folks some privacy. Congratulations again, Marcus." As he moved toward the door, I noticed him squeeze Rebecca's shoulder, a gesture that lasted a second too long to be purely professional. After Dr. Pierce left, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Emma made small noises in Rebecca's arms, blissfully unaware of the tension surrounding her arrival. I sat down in the chair beside the bed, still holding the unsigned birth certificate. "Rebecca, I need you to look at me and tell me the truth." My voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it. "Is Emma mine?" The question shattered whatever pretense we'd been maintaining. Rebecca's tears spilled over, running down her cheeks as she clutched Emma tighter. "How can you ask me that? How can you doubt me like this?" But her response was an evasion, not an answer. Linda moved protectively closer to her daughter. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Marcus, accusing your wife of such things on the day your daughter was born." I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, hands clasped. The smell of antiseptic and baby powder filled my nostrils, but underneath it, I caught a whiff of expensive cologne that definitely wasn't mine. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything yet. I'm asking a simple question that deserves a simple answer." Rebecca wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. "Of course she's yours, Marcus. How could you even think otherwise?" But the words sounded rehearsed, like she'd been practicing them. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Phoenix skyline as the morning sun climbed higher. My reflection stared back at me, a man in work clothes holding divorce papers he'd never expected to need. Behind me, I could hear Rebecca whispering to her mother, their voices low and urgent. When I turned back around, Linda was glaring at me with undisguised hostility. "You're going to destroy your family over paranoid suspicions, Marcus. Is that really what you want?" I walked back to the bedside table and picked up the birth certificate again.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The pen felt heavy in my hand, loaded with 18 years of responsibility and doubt. "Here's what I want," I said, my voice calm and measured. "I want a DNA test. Before I sign anything, before I claim this child as mine, I want scientific proof." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Rebecca's sobs grew louder and Linda's face turned red with anger. "That's outrageous," Linda snapped. "You're humiliating your wife and questioning the legitimacy of your own child." But I wasn't backing down. 12 years on the road had taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong. "If Emma is mine, then the test will prove it, and we can all move forward. If she's not," I let the sentence hang unfinished. Rebecca looked up at me through her tears, and for just a moment, I saw something that looked like fear in her eyes. "Marcus, please don't do this to us. Please don't destroy our family." The pleading in her voice broke my heart, but not enough to make me ignore the evidence piling up around us. Dr. Pierce's overly familiar presence, the timing issues, the expensive gifts from unknown sources, the way Rebecca couldn't give me a straight answer to a straightforward question. I set the pen down next to the unsigned birth certificate and looked at my wife, the woman I'd loved for 8 years, the woman I'd trusted completely while I drove highways across America. "I'll be back in 72 hours with the test results," I said. "Until then, Emma's birth certificate stays unsigned." Linda's voice rose to a near shout. "You can't be serious. You're abandoning your wife and newborn daughter over suspicions." But I was already walking toward the door. "I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm protecting myself from signing legal documents based on lies." The last thing I heard as the door closed behind me was Rebecca calling my name, her voice broken with sobs that might have been genuine remorse or practiced manipulation. Walking back through the hospital corridors toward the parking lot, my mind reeled with the implications of what I'd just done. For years I'd been the steady provider, the reliable husband who worked hard and never questioned the foundation of our marriage. I'd trusted Rebecca with everything while I was on the road, never doubting her faithfulness, never suspecting that my absence might create opportunities I couldn't control. The idea that she might have been lying to me for months, possibly carrying another man's child while I planned our future, made my stomach turn. But beneath the nausea and betrayal, there was something else, a cold certainty that I'd done the right thing. Trust without verification wasn't trust at all, it was willful blindness. The Phoenix heat hit me like a wall as I stepped outside, even though it was still morning. I sat in my truck for several minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with text messages, first from Rebecca, then from Linda, both begging me to come back, to reconsider, to think about what I was doing to our family. But I didn't respond to either of them. Instead, I drove to a medical lab across town that advertised same-day DNA testing services. The process was simpler than I'd expected. A quick cheek swab, some paperwork, and a promise that results would be available within 72 hours. The lab technician, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. "These tests are very accurate," she assured me. "Whatever the results, at least you'll know the truth." The truth, that's all I wanted, all I'd ever wanted. For 12 years, I'd built my life on the assumption that Rebecca and I were partners, that our marriage was built on honesty and mutual respect. The possibility that those assumptions were wrong felt like discovering that gravity might stop working at any moment. Everything I'd believed about my life, my future, my family, suddenly seemed negotiable. I drove home to our house in Scottsdale, the same house we'd bought together 5 years ago, the house where we'd planned to raise Emma and maybe more children after her. The nursery was exactly as we'd left it, lavender walls and white furniture waiting for a baby who might not be mine. That evening, alone in our king-sized bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed every conversation Rebecca and I had shared over the past 9 months. Looking back with suspicious eyes, patterns emerged that I'd missed before. The way she'd started mentioning Dr. Pierce more frequently in our phone calls, how she'd suddenly developed an interest in dental conferences and professional development seminars that required weekend attendance. The expensive maternity clothes that appeared in her closet, brands we couldn't normally afford on our budget. Late-night texts that she'd claimed were from her sister in California, despite the 3-hour time difference making such calls unlikely. All the pieces of a puzzle I'd been too trusting to assemble. The next morning, I called my dispatcher and requested emergency family leave. Jimmy Rodriguez, a supervisor I'd known for 8 years, didn't ask many questions. "Take all the time you need, Marcus. Family comes first." If only he knew how complicated my family situation had become. I spent the day walking through our house like a detective, looking for evidence I'd been too blind to see before. In Rebecca's jewelry box, I found a pair of diamond earrings I'd never seen before, expensive pieces that were far beyond our normal gift-giving budget. In her dresser drawer, buried under winter sweaters, I discovered a romantic greeting card signed "Forever Yours," N, with a date from 3 months ago, right around the time Rebecca claimed she'd been working late shifts at the dental office. The hardest part wasn't finding the evidence of Rebecca's affair. The hardest part was realizing how thoroughly I'd been played, how every lie had been crafted to exploit my trust and my absence. While I'd been driving through Nevada and Colorado, proud of the overtime pay that would help support our growing family, Rebecca had been building a relationship with her boss that had apparently grown far beyond professional boundaries. The timeline was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence I uncovered. The affair had likely been going on for at least 6 months, possibly longer. Emma's conception would have occurred right in the middle of that timeline, when I was completing a long-haul delivery to Seattle that kept me away from home for nearly 2 weeks. On the second day of waiting, Linda called me 3 times. Each conversation followed the same pattern. She'd start with accusations about my paranoia and cruelty, then shift to pleading for Rebecca and Emma's sake, and finally resort to threats about how my behavior would be viewed by family court judges if the marriage ended in divorce. "You're destroying a good woman over nothing," she said during the 3rd call. "Rebecca loves you, Marcus. She's never given you any reason to doubt her." But Linda's defense of her daughter felt increasingly desperate, like a lawyer making arguments she didn't quite believe herself. I wondered how much Linda knew about Rebecca's relationship with Dr. Pierce, how much she'd chosen to ignore in order to maintain the fiction of her daughter's perfect marriage. The waiting was torture, but it also gave me time to think clearly about the future. If the DNA test confirmed that Emma was mine, I'd have to decide whether I could forgive Rebecca's betrayal and somehow rebuild our marriage. The thought of raising a daughter while constantly wondering about her mother's faithfulness made my chest tight with anxiety. If Emma wasn't mine, then everything became simpler in some ways and infinitely more complicated in others. I'd be free to walk away from Rebecca's lies, but I'd also be leaving behind a child I'd already started to love, even if she wasn't biologically mine. Either way, the trust that had anchored our marriage for 8 years was probably gone forever. The call came on Thursday afternoon while I was sitting in my truck outside a diner in Tempe, picking at a plate of eggs I'd barely touched. The lab technician's voice was professional but gentle. "Mr. Thompson, your results are ready. Would you prefer to receive them over the phone or in person?" My heart hammered as I told her I'd drive right over. The 20-minute trip to the lab felt like the longest journey of my life, longer than any cross-country haul I'd ever completed. In the lab's small waiting room, surrounded by medical charts and motivational posters, I opened the envelope with shaking hands. The language was technical and formal, but the conclusion was crystal clear. Probability of paternity, 0%. Emma was not my biological daughter. The drive home passed in a blur of desert landscape and scattered thoughts, 8 years of marriage, months of planning for fatherhood, a nursery painted with dreams that would never be realized. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected, not just because Rebecca had been unfaithful, but because she'd been willing to let me sign legal documents claiming responsibility for another man's child. She would have let me spend the next 18 years of my life, paying for and raising Emma, never knowing that the little girl calling me daddy shared no blood with me at all. The calculated nature of the deception was almost worse than the affair itself. It suggested a level of coldness I'd never imagined Rebecca possessed. When I arrived home, Rebecca was waiting for me in the living room, Emma sleeping in a portable bassinet beside the couch. Linda sat across from them, her face set in hard lines of defiance. Rebecca looked up as I walked in, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Marcus, please, can we talk about this? Can we figure out a way to move forward?" She gestured toward Emma, who looked peaceful and innocent in her pink blanket. "Whatever happened before, Emma needs a father. She needs stability." Linda nodded emphatically. "That's right. This child didn't choose to be born into this situation. You can't punish her for whatever mistakes were made." I sat down across from them, the DNA test results folded in my pocket like a loaded weapon. "Before we talk about Emma's future, I need you to tell me about Dr. Nathan Pierce." Rebecca's face went white at the mention of his name. "What do you want to know?" she whispered. "I want to know how long you've been sleeping with him. I want to know when the affair started. I want to know if you ever planned to tell me the truth." The questions came out methodical and calm, but each one hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with fresh sobs. Linda stood up, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "How dare you attack her like this? She's vulnerable, she's hormonal, she just gave birth." But I wasn't backing down. "She's also been lying to me for months, possibly years, and she was prepared to let me claim legal responsibility for a child that isn't mine." I pulled the DNA results from my pocket and laid them on the coffee table between us. The papers seemed to glow under the living room lights, scientific proof of Rebecca's betrayal written in clinical language that left no room for interpretation. Rebecca stared at the documents, as if they might spontaneously combust. Linda's face crumpled as she read the numbers, her righteous anger deflating like a punctured balloon. "This can't be right," she said weakly. "Tests can be wrong." Rebecca finally looked up, her face streaked with tears and resignation. "The affair started about 7 months ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nathan and we connected over coffee after work one day. You were gone for 2 weeks on that Seattle run, and I was lonely. He was kind, attentive, everything I needed at that moment." The confession poured out of her like poison from a wound. It was supposed to be just emotional support at first, but it became physical. "When I found out I was pregnant, I ended things with Nathan immediately. I thought maybe the baby was yours, that we could just pretend nothing had happened." Linda sat down heavily, staring at her daughter as if seeing her for the first time. The clinical details of Rebecca's betrayal hurt less than the calculated deception that followed. "So when you called me about Emma being born early, you knew there was a chance she wasn't mine?" Rebecca nodded miserably. "I hoped she was yours, I prayed she would be, but when she was born and I saw her features, I knew the truth." The admission hung in the air like a confession at trial. "You would have let me sign that birth certificate, knowing Emma wasn't my daughter." Rebecca's silence was answer enough. Linda looked stricken, apparently realizing for the first time the full extent of her daughter's deception. "Rebecca, how could you do such a thing to Marcus? How could you be so cruel?" Standing up from the couch, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. The truth was finally out, all the lies and deceptions laid bare. There would be no reconciliation, no attempt to rebuild trust that had been so thoroughly shattered. "I'll be filing for divorce on Monday," I said calmly. "Since Emma isn't mine, there won't be any child support or custody issues to complicate things. You and Dr. Pierce can figure out your future together." Rebecca reached out toward me, her hands shaking. "Marcus, please, we can work through this. I made mistakes, but we have history together. We have 8 years of marriage that has to count for something, but 8 years of marriage built on lies wasn't a foundation worth saving. It was just 8 years of being fooled. Linda tried one last appeal to sentiment. Think about what you're throwing away, Marcus. Think about the good times you and Rebecca shared. Surely that means something. I looked around the living room at the photos on the mantel, images of Rebecca and me at various stages of our relationship, wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, anniversary dinners. They look like evidence from someone else's life now, artifacts from a marriage that had been built on false premises. The good times were real for me, I said, but apparently they weren't enough for Rebecca. She chose to look elsewhere while I was working to support our family. The finality in my voice seemed to settle over the room like dust. I packed a bag with enough clothes for a few days and loaded it into my truck. Before leaving, I stopped by the nursery one last time, looking at the lavender walls and white furniture that would never serve their intended purpose. Emma would grow up in this room, but she wouldn't be calling me daddy. Some other man, probably Nathan Pierce, would teach her to ride a bike and help her with homework and walk her down the aisle at her wedding. The loss of that future hurt more than I'd expected, even knowing she wasn't biologically mine. I'd been prepared to love her unconditionally, to be the father she deserved. Rebecca's deception had stolen that opportunity from both of us. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly straightforward. Without child support or custody complications, the lawyers focused primarily on property division and debt allocation. Rebecca kept the house, since she'd need room for Emma, and presumably Nathan would be contributing to household expenses soon enough. I kept my truck, my savings account, and my freedom. The final decree was signed on a Tuesday morning in a Phoenix courtroom that smelled like floor wax and broken dreams. Rebecca didn't contest any of my terms. She looked pale and defeated, aging years in the weeks since Emma's birth. Linda sat beside her, offering silent support but no longer defending her daughter's actions. After the divorce was final, I took a long-haul assignment that kept me on the road for 6 weeks, driving through Montana and North Dakota as winter settled over the northern plains. The solitude of long-distance trucking, which had once felt isolating, now felt healing. Mile after mile of highway gave me space to process the betrayal and begin planning a future that didn't include Rebecca's lies. I called my dispatcher from a truck stop outside Billings and requested a transfer to the West Coast routes. Arizona held too many memories, too many reminders of the life I'd thought I was building. Starting over required a change of scenery. The irony wasn't lost on me that Nathan Pierce, the man who'd destroyed my marriage, would now be facing the same challenges I'd once accepted as part of late nights with a crying baby, diaper changes, the financial pressure of supporting a family. Rebecca's tendency toward emotional manipulation and selective honesty would become his problem now. I wondered how long their relationship would last once the excitement of secrecy wore off and they were faced with the mundane realities of domestic life. Men who pursue married women are often less interested in the responsibilities that come with family than they are in the thrill of conquest. 6 months after the divorce, I was driving through Oregon when I got a call from an unexpected source. Linda, Rebecca's mother, reached out to tell me that Rebecca and Nathan's relationship had already soured. He wasn't ready for the reality of being a father, she explained, her voice heavy with disappointment. He's been pushing Rebecca to put Emma up for adoption, saying he's not prepared for the responsibility. The news didn't surprise me. Men who break up marriages for temporary pleasure rarely possess the character needed for long-term commitment. Rebecca had traded a faithful husband for a selfish coward who wasn't even willing to claim his own daughter. Linda's call wasn't just about updating me on Rebecca's situation. She wanted to apologize for her role in supporting her daughter's deception. I should have encouraged Rebecca to tell you the truth from the beginning, she admitted. I was so focused on protecting her that I forgot you deserved honesty too. You were a good husband, Marcus, better than she deserved. The apology couldn't undo the damage, but it provided a small measure of closure. Linda had always been protective of Rebecca, sometimes to the point of enabling bad behavior. Her acknowledgement of my character and Rebecca's failures felt like a final vindication. The most difficult aspect of moving forward wasn't the loneliness or the financial adjustments that came with single life. It was wondering about Emma, the little girl who'd spent 3 days of her life thinking I might be her father. I found myself checking Rebecca's social media occasionally, seeing photos of Emma growing and reaching milestones. She was a beautiful child with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded me of neither Rebecca nor Nathan. In another universe, where Rebecca had been faithful and honest, I might have been the one teaching Emma to walk or reading her bedtime stories. That alternate reality haunted me more than the betrayal itself. One evening in Seattle, while I was unloading a shipment of computer equipment, I met a woman named Jennifer who worked in the warehouse receiving department. She was intelligent, straightforward, and refreshingly honest about her own divorce from a cheating spouse 3 years earlier. Our first conversation lasted 2 hours, mostly about trust and rebuilding after betrayal. Jennifer understood the specific pain that comes with discovering your partner's infidelity, the way it makes you question not just their character but your own judgment. We began meeting for coffee whenever my routes brought me through Seattle, gradually building a friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience. Jennifer never asked invasive questions about my marriage to Rebecca or demanded details about Emma's paternity situation. She seemed to understand intuitively that some wounds needed time and space to heal properly. When I was ready to share more of my story, she listened without judgment, offering perspective from someone who'd walked a similar path. Her ex-husband had also been conducting an affair with a coworker, complete with elaborate deceptions and gaslighting techniques designed to make Jennifer doubt her own perceptions. The parallels in our stories were both comforting and sobering. After nearly a year of cautious friendship, Jennifer and I began dating seriously. The relationship progressed slowly, built on a foundation of honesty that had been lacking in my marriage to Rebecca. Jennifer valued loyalty and straightforward communication, qualities that had been eroded in my previous relationship until they barely existed. We talked openly about our fears and expectations, about the difficulty of trusting again after being thoroughly deceived by people we'd loved. Neither of us was interested in rushing into marriage or cohabitation. We were both too aware of how quickly apparent stability could crumble when built on false premises. The contrast between my relationship with Jennifer and my marriage to Rebecca became clearer over time. With Rebecca, I'd often felt like I was guessing at her true feelings or motivations, trying to read between the lines of conversations that seemed to carry hidden meanings. With Jennifer, communication was direct and honest. If she was upset about something, she said so clearly and specifically. If she needed space or time to process emotions, she asked for it directly rather than creating drama or manipulation. The relief of being in a relationship without hidden agendas or secret communications was profound. 2 years after my divorce from Rebecca, I learned through mutual acquaintances that her relationship with Nathan had indeed ended badly. He'd left Phoenix entirely, taking a position with a dental practice in California, and abandoning any pretense of responsibility for Emma. Rebecca was now a single mother, working part-time and relying heavily on her mother for childcare and financial support. The man who'd been so charming and attentive during their affair had proven to be exactly what I'd suspected, a selfish individual interested in excitement rather than commitment. Rebecca had traded a stable marriage for temporary passion, and found herself alone with a child whose father wanted nothing to do with his responsibilities. The news about Rebecca's situation stirred complicated emotions. Part of me felt vindicated. Her choices had led to predictable consequences. But another part of me felt genuine sadness for Emma, an innocent child who deserved better than the adults who'd created her complicated situation. Rebecca's poor judgment had affected not just our marriage but her daughter's future stability as well. Emma would grow up without a father figure, not because of biology or circumstance, but because of her mother's decisions and her biological father's cowardice. The ripple effects of infidelity extend far beyond the immediate betrayal, creating instability that can affect children for years. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that demanding the DNA test had been the right decision, even though it destroyed my marriage and caused tremendous pain for everyone involved. The alternative, Anna signing Emma's birth certificate based on lies and spending the next 18 years raising another man's child while Rebecca continued her deceptions, would have been far worse. Truth, even painful truth, provides a foundation for making informed decisions about the future. Lies, no matter how well-intentioned, create instability that eventually collapses under its own weight. The experience taught me valuable lessons about trust, verification, and the importance of honest communication in relationships. Trust should be based on demonstrated character and consistent behavior over time, not on assumptions or wishful thinking. When someone's actions contradict their words repeatedly, it's reasonable to question their honesty and demand clarity. Love without honesty isn't sustainable, it's just emotional manipulation disguised as affection. My relationship with Jennifer continued to strengthen as we built something genuine together, free from the deceptions and hidden agendas that had poisoned my marriage. To Rebecca, we eventually moved in together in Portland, creating a household based on mutual respect and straightforward communication. Jennifer's children from her previous marriage, 2 boys aged 12 and 14, accepted me gradually as a stable presence in their lives. The contrast between being chosen as a father figure versus being tricked into claiming paternity was significant. These boys wanted me in their lives, and their mother was honest about her expectations and hopes for our future together. 3 months into my new relationship with Jennifer, I received an unexpected phone call that would shake the foundations of everything I thought I understood about my divorce from Rebecca. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Ray Martinez from the Phoenix Police Department's Fraud Division. His tone was professional but carried an undertone of urgency that made my stomach clench with familiar dread. "Mr. Thompson, I'm calling regarding your ex-wife Rebecca and her former employer Dr. Nathan Pierce. We've uncovered some information that might be relevant to your divorce proceedings, and we'd like to speak with you when you're next in the Phoenix area." The detective wouldn't elaborate over the phone, citing ongoing investigations and the need for confidential testimony. But his call triggered a cascade of questions I'd thought were behind me. What new information could possibly emerge about Rebecca and Nathan's affair? The divorce had been finalized for months, the property divided, the legal ties severed. I was building a new life with Jennifer in Portland, deliberately putting distance between myself and the wreckage of my marriage. Yet something in Detective Martinez's voice suggested that the story I thought I knew was incomplete, that there were layers of deception I hadn't even begun to uncover. Jennifer noticed my distraction immediately when I ended the call. We were sitting in her kitchen, sharing morning coffee before I left for a delivery run to Sacramento. The domesticity of the moment, the normalcy of discussing weekend plans and grocery lists stood in stark contrast to the chaos that seemed to follow me from Phoenix like a persistent shadow. "Bad news?" she asked, her voice gentle but observant. I'd learned to appreciate Jennifer's direct approach to difficult conversations. She didn't pry or manipulate for information, but she also didn't pretend not to notice when something was troubling me. It was a refreshing change from Rebecca's tendency to extract information through emotional manipulation or strategic silence. I explained the detective's call as thoroughly as I could, given the limited information I'd been provided. Jennifer listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned as I described the implications of an ongoing fraud investigation involving my ex-wife and her former boss. "Do you think this is connected to the paternity situation?" she asked. It was a logical question, but one that opened uncomfortable possibilities. If Rebecca had been involved in criminal activity beyond simple adultery, it could explain some of the inconsistencies I'd noticed during our marriage but attributed to her affair. The expensive gifts, the sudden changes in spending habits, the defensive reactions when I'd asked about her work schedule. The drive to Phoenix took 2 days, longer than usual because I had to coordinate the trip with my delivery schedule and arrange time off for what might become extended legal proceedings. Detective Martinez had been vague about the timeline, mentioning only that several individuals were being interviewed as part of a larger investigation into financial irregularities. At Dr. Pierce's dental practice, the phrase financial irregularities could cover everything from insurance fraud to embezzlement, and I found myself wondering how deep Rebecca's involvement might go. Had she been a willing participant in criminal activity, or had Nathan manipulated her into illegal behavior the same way he'd manipulated her into adultery? The Phoenix Police Department's Fraud Division occupied a sterile office building that smelled like industrial carpet and burnt coffee. Detective Martinez was a compact man in his 40s with graying hair and the weary expression of someone who'd spent years investigating white-collar crime. He led me to a small interview room equipped with recording equipment and a table covered in manila folders that presumably contained evidence related to Dr. Pierce's activities. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate you making the trip down here. What we've discovered about Dr. Pierce's operation extends well beyond personal misconduct. We're looking at a sophisticated scheme involving insurance fraud, patient billing irregularity, and potential money laundering." The detective opened the first folder, revealing photocopied bank statements, canceled checks, and financial records that painted a picture of systematic theft spanning several years. Pierce had been billing insurance companies for procedures never performed, creating phantom patients to justify equipment purchases, and skimming cash payments from legitimate patients to fund what appeared to be an elaborate lifestyle well beyond his legitimate income. "Your ex-wife's name appears on several of these documents," Detective Martinez explained, pointing to Rebecca's signature on various forms and authorizations. She was involved in the billing department, had access to patient records, and according to several witnesses was aware of the fraudulent activities. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Rebecca hadn't just betrayed our marriage through her affair with Nathan Pierce. She'd potentially been involved in criminal activity that could have legal consequences extending far beyond divorce proceedings. If she was charged and convicted of fraud, she could face significant jail time, leaving Emma without either parent in any meaningful capacity. The thought of that innocent child becoming a victim of her parents' poor choices added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. "What kind of evidence do you have of Rebecca's involvement?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the turmoil building in my chest. Detective Martinez spread out additional documents, including computer printouts showing Rebecca's access to billing software, email communications between her and Dr. Pierce, discussing patient accounts, and witness statements from other dental office employees who'd observed suspicious activities. Multiple staff members have testified that Mrs. Thompson was present during conversations about manipulating insurance claims, that she processed payments that were never properly recorded, and that she received cash bonuses that appear to be tied to fraudulent billing cycles. The weight of evidence was substantial, painting Rebecca as a willing participant rather than an unwitting accomplice in Dr. P. Detective's next revelation was even more shocking. "We believe the affair between your ex-wife and Dr. Pierce was initially a business arrangement designed to ensure her silence and cooperation. The romantic relationship may have developed later, but the financial incentive was always primary." He showed me bank records indicating that Rebecca had been receiving regular cash deposits that coincided with her increased involvement in the fraudulent billing scheme. She was essentially being paid to commit crimes and keep quiet about Dr. Pierce's activities. The personal relationship was likely a method of control, a way to ensure her loyalty and continued cooperation. The implications were staggering. Rebecca hadn't just cheated on me with her boss. She'd entered into what amounted to a criminal partnership that involved fraud, deception, and the systematic theft of money from insurance companies and patients. The expensive gifts I'd noticed, the designer clothes and jewelry that had seemed beyond our budget, weren't tokens of romantic affection. They were payments for criminal services, bribes to maintain her silence and cooperation in an ongoing theft operation. The affair had been a tool of coercion, a way for Nathan to ensure Rebecca's continued participation in illegal activities. As Detective Martinez continued explaining the scope of the investigation, I realized that my instincts about Rebecca's deception had been accurate, but incomplete. I'd suspected adultery and questioned Emma's paternity, but I'd missed the criminal dimension of her relationship with Dr. Pierce entirely. The late nights she'd claimed were work-related, actually were work-related, just not the kind of legitimate work she'd described. The stress and defensive behavior I'd attributed to guilt over her affair was likely also connected to anxiety about potential criminal exposure. She'd been living a double life that was even more complex and dangerous than I'd imagined. The detective's questions about my observations during the marriage were thorough and methodical. He wanted to know about changes in Rebecca's spending patterns, any suspicious conversations I might have overheard, unusual visits or phone calls that had seemed out of character. Looking back through the lens of criminal investigation rather than marital suspicion, details that had seemed innocuous now appeared significant. Rebecca's insistence on handling all the household finances, her nervousness when certain topics came up in conversation, the way she'd sometimes seemed to be performing happiness rather than genuinely experiencing it. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a series of text messages between Rebecca and Nathan that had been recovered from the dental office's computer system. The messages discussed not just their personal relationship but also specific strategies for manipulating insurance claims and avoiding detection by regulatory authorities. "Your ex-wife wasn't just having an affair with Dr. Pierce," Detective Martinez explained. "She was his primary accomplice in a criminal enterprise that defrauded multiple insurance companies out of hundreds of thousands of dollars over a 3-year period." The timeline of Rebecca's criminal involvement coincided almost exactly with the period when our marriage had begun deteriorating. The stress of living a double life, the constant fear of discovery, the moral compromise required to participate in systematic fraud, all of these factors had likely contributed to the emotional distance I'd noticed between us. Rebecca hadn't just been unfaithful, she'd been carrying the psychological burden of ongoing criminal activity, which had poisoned every aspect of our relationship. The woman I'd been married to for the final 2 years of our relationship was essentially a stranger, someone whose true loyalties and activities were completely hidden from me. Detective Martinez explained that Rebecca was being offered a plea agreement in exchange for her cooperation in the case against Dr. Pierce. The prosecution believed Pierce was the primary architect of the fraud scheme and that Rebecca, along with several other employees, had been coerced or manipulated into participation. We're hoping she'll testify against Pierce in exchange for reduced charges, but that depends on her willingness to cooperate fully and honestly about her involvement. The detective's expression suggested he had doubts about Rebecca's reliability as a witness, given her demonstrated capacity for deception and manipulation. The revelation about Rebecca's criminal activities explained several mysteries that had puzzled me during our divorce proceedings. Her reluctance to provide complete financial records, her insistence on keeping certain bank accounts private, the way she'd seemed almost relieved when I'd filed for divorce, as if the end of our marriage removed a source of dangerous exposure. She'd likely been terrified that a thorough examination of our finances during divorce proceedings would uncover evidence of her illegal income and lead to criminal charges. As the interview concluded, Detective Martinez handed me a business card and explained that I might be called to testify about my observations during the marriage. Your testimony about the changes in Mrs. Thompson's behavior and spending patterns could be relevant to establishing the timeline and scope of her involvement in Dr. Pierce's operation. The possibility of testifying against Rebecca in a criminal trial felt surreal. I'd gone from loving husband to divorce petitioner to potential prosecution witness in the space of 2 years. The woman I'd once planned to spend my life with had become a defendant in a criminal case that could send her to federal prison. The drive back to Portland was emotionally exhausting. I called Jennifer from a truck stop outside Flagstaff and tried to explain the day's revelations without overwhelming her with details she didn't need to carry. Her response was characteristically direct and supportive. "This isn't your fault, Marcus. You couldn't have known about criminal activity she was hiding from you. The important thing is that you're not involved and you're moving forward with your life." Her practical approach to the situation was exactly what I needed. Jennifer didn't dramatize or catastrophize. She acknowledged the complexity of the situation while maintaining focus on what actually mattered for our relationship and future. The criminal investigation into Dr. Pierce's dental practice made local news within weeks of my interview with Detective Martinez. The Phoenix Business Journal ran a front-page story about the alleged fraud scheme, complete with photographs of Pierce being led away in handcuffs and speculation about the total amount of money involved in the theft. Rebecca's name appeared in the coverage as a co-conspirator cooperating with federal investigators, a description that probably felt like public humiliation to someone who'd once been respected in her professional community. Reading about Rebecca's downfall in news coverage felt strange and unsettling. The woman described in the articles as a participant in systematic fraud seemed disconnected from the person I'd married 8 years earlier. Either Rebecca had changed dramatically during our marriage, becoming someone capable of criminal behavior, or I'd never truly known who she was in the first place. Both possibilities were disturbing in different ways. If she'd changed, it suggested that people could transform in ways that completely contradicted their apparent character. If I'd never known her authentic self, it meant my judgment about intimate relationships was fundamentally flawed. Jennifer and I discussed the news coverage one evening while preparing dinner in her Portland kitchen. She'd read the articles I'd shown her but didn't seem particularly surprised by the developments. "People who lie about big things usually lie about smaller things too," she observed while chopping vegetables for our salad. "If Rebecca was willing to deceive you about Emma's paternity and participate in insurance fraud, she probably wasn't honest about much else either." Her matter-of-fact assessment was probably accurate, but it still stung to hear my 8-year marriage characterized as a relationship built on systematic deception. The federal charges against Dr. Pierce were serious enough to warrant significant media attention throughout Arizona. The indictment alleged wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades of prison time if he was convicted on all counts. Rebecca's plea agreement apparently involved testifying about Pierce's methods for manipulating insurance claims, his use of fraudulent patient records, and his recruitment of staff members to participate in the illegal activities. Her cooperation with prosecutors would likely result in reduced charges, but she was still facing potential jail time and certainly would lose her professional license. Several months after the initial charges were filed, I received another call from Detective Martinez with an update on the case. Dr. Pierce had rejected a plea agreement and was planning to fight the charges at trial, which meant Rebecca's testimony would be crucial to the prosecution's case. Pierce's defense team is apparently planning to argue that he was the victim of employee theft, that Rebecca and other staff members were embezzling money without his knowledge, the detective explained. "It's a risky strategy given the evidence we have, but it means the trial could be contentious and lengthy. The prospect of Rebecca testifying in a federal criminal trial added another layer of complexity to her already difficult situation. She would be required to admit publicly to criminal behavior, describe her affair with Pierce in detail, and potentially face aggressive cross-examination designed to undermine her credibility. The defense would likely focus on her personal relationship with Pierce, arguing that she had romantic rather than professional motivations for participating in the fraud. The strategy would probably involve portraying Rebecca as a scorned lover seeking revenge rather than a credible witness to systematic criminal activity. As the trial date approached, I found myself wondering about Rebecca's emotional state and her ability to handle the pressure of public testimony. Testifying against a former lover in a federal criminal case would be traumatic under the best circumstances. Doing so while facing her own criminal charges and dealing with the aftermath of our divorce would be overwhelming for most people. I felt a strange mixture of sympathy and detachment thinking about her situation. The woman who'd betrayed our marriage and deceived me about Emma's paternity was now facing consequences that extended far beyond personal relationships into potential federal imprisonment. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in downtown Phoenix, generating local media coverage that portrayed Dr. Pierce as a respected professional who'd allegedly used his position to commit systematic fraud. Rebecca was scheduled to testify during the prosecution's case-in-chief, which meant she would likely take the witness stand within the first week of proceedings. I considered attending the trial, but ultimately decided that watching Rebecca's testimony would be emotionally unhealthy and serve no constructive purpose. My involvement in the case was peripheral, limited to providing background information about her behavior during our marriage. Jennifer supported my decision to avoid the trial coverage, understanding that following the proceedings closely would prevent me from fully moving forward with my life. "You've already given the information they need," she pointed out during one of our evening conversations. "Watching Rebecca testify isn't going to change anything about your divorce or your future. It's just going to keep you emotionally connected to a situation that's already resolved." Her perspective was wise and practical, reflecting the emotional maturity that made our relationship so different from my marriage. To Rebecca, the trial lasted 3 weeks, generating daily news coverage that was difficult to avoid entirely. Dr. Pierce's defense team apparently pursued the strategy Detective Martinez had predicted, arguing that Rebecca and other employees had manipulated the billing system without Pierce's knowledge or authorization. The defense portrayed Pierce as a dedicated professional who'd been victimized by dishonest employees who'd exploited his trust to commit fraud. Rebecca's testimony was described in news reports as detailed and emotional, with prosecutors using her account to establish Pierce's direct involvement in planning and implementing the fraudulent billing practices. The jury's verdict was announced on a Friday afternoon, with Dr. Pierce convicted on all counts related to fraud and money laundering. The conviction vindicated Rebecca's testimony and the prosecution's theory of the case, but it also meant that her former boss and lover would likely spend the next decade or more in federal prison. The news coverage described Pierce as showing no emotion when the verdict was read, maintaining the professional composure that had apparently helped him convince patients and staff members to trust him despite his criminal activities. Rebecca's sentencing hearing was scheduled for several months after Pierce's conviction, allowing time for the preparation of pre-sentence reports and victim impact statements. The plea agreement she'd negotiated apparently called for a sentence of probation and community service rather than imprisonment, reflecting her cooperation with prosecutors and her role as a secondary participant rather than the primary architect of the fraud scheme. She would also be required to pay restitution to the defrauded insurance companies and would permanently lose her professional license to work in healthcare-related fields. The financial restitution requirements would likely create significant hardship for Rebecca, who was already struggling as a single mother without Nathan Pierce's financial support. The amount owed to insurance companies was substantial, and her ability to earn income would be limited by her criminal conviction and loss of professional credentials. Emma would grow up in reduced circumstances, affected by both her mother's criminal conviction and her father's abandonment. The ripple effects of Rebecca's choices would impact her daughter for years to come. Several months after Pierce's conviction, I received a handwritten letter from Rebecca that had been forwarded through my attorney's office. The letter was several pages long, written on plain notebook paper in Rebecca's familiar handwriting. Her message was part apology, part explanation, and part plea for understanding. She wrote about the gradual nature of her involvement in Pierce's criminal activities, describing how she'd initially believed his explanations about billing irregularities and had only slowly realized the extent of the fraud. She claimed that by the time she understood what was happening, she felt trapped by her knowledge and afraid of the consequences of reporting Pierce's activities. Rebecca's letter also addressed our marriage and her affair with Pierce in terms I'd never heard before. She wrote that Pierce had manipulated her emotionally and professionally, using her loneliness during my long absences to draw her into both personal and criminal relationships. She described feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation and terrified of losing her job, her professional reputation, and her ability to support Emma. The letter painted Pierce as a predatory figure who'd exploited vulnerable employees for both criminal and personal purposes. While I appreciated Rebecca's attempt to provide context for her behavior, the letter also felt like an effort to minimize her responsibility for the choices she'd made. Claiming manipulation and coercion didn't change the fact that she'd participated in criminal activity for years and had been willing to let me claim paternity for another man's child. The explanations offered in her letter might provide some understanding of her motivations, but they didn't excuse the betrayals or repair the damage done to our marriage and my trust in intimate relationships. I shared Rebecca's letter with Jennifer, who read it carefully before offering her perspective. "She's trying to rewrite history to make herself look like more of a victim than she actually was," Jennifer observed. "People who make bad choices often try to blame circumstances or other people instead of taking full responsibility for their actions." Jennifer's assessment was probably accurate, reflecting her own experience with an unfaithful ex-husband who'd also tried to minimize his responsibility for destructive choices. The pattern of blame shifting and victimization seemed common among people who'd betrayed intimate relationships. I decided not to respond to Rebecca's letter, feeling that any communication would be inappropriate given our completed divorce and her ongoing legal situation. Maintaining distance from Rebecca and her problems was essential for my emotional health and for the stability of my relationship with Jennifer. Rebecca's attempts to explain or justify her behavior were ultimately irrelevant to my future happiness and well-being. The facts of her betrayal and criminal activity were established. Her motivations and explanations wouldn't change the consequences or repair the trust that had been destroyed. The final chapter in Rebecca's legal saga came 6 months later, when she was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and restitution payments totaling nearly $150,000 to the defrauded insurance companies. The sentence was lighter than what she might have faced without her cooperation in the case against Pierce, but it still represented significant consequences for her criminal behavior. She would be under court supervision for 2 years, required to maintain employment and make regular restitution payments that would strain her finances for years to come. The news of Rebecca's sentencing reached me through a brief newspaper article that mentioned her name along with several other defendants who'd been involved in Pierce's fraud scheme. Reading about her fate felt anticlimactic after months of legal proceedings and media coverage. The woman who'd once been the center of my world was now just another name in a criminal case, facing consequences that would affect her life and Emma's future in ways I could only imagine. The distance between my current life with Jennifer and the chaos of Rebecca's situation felt vast and permanent. Emma would be celebrating her 2nd birthday soon, growing up in circumstances I'd never anticipated when we'd painted that nursery in lavender and white. Her mother was a convicted criminal facing years of financial hardship and court supervision. Her biological father was serving a lengthy federal prison sentence and had shown no interest in claiming parental responsibility. The child I'd briefly thought might be my daughter was now essentially orphaned by her parents' choices, dependent on her grandmother Linda for stability and support. Occasionally I found myself wondering about Emma's welfare and future prospects. Linda was in her 60s and dealing with significant health problems that would limit her ability to provide long-term care for a young child. Rebecca's criminal conviction and financial obligations would make it difficult for her to be a fully present parent, even if she avoided imprisonment. Emma deserved better than the unstable situation created by her parents' selfishness and criminal behavior, but there was nothing I could do to improve her circumstances without compromising my own emotional health and relationship with Jennifer. The contrast between Emma's uncertain future and the stability Jennifer's children enjoyed was stark and troubling. Jennifer's boys had 2 parents who prioritized their welfare above personal desires, who communicated honestly about challenges and expectations, and who worked together to provide emotional and financial security. Emma had none of these advantages, despite having done nothing to deserve such difficult circumstances. The unfairness of the situation was a painful reminder that children often suffer most from their parents' poor choices. As I reflected on the 2 years that had passed since Emma's birth and my confrontation with Rebecca in that Phoenix hospital room, I realized that demanding the DNA test had been one of the most important decisions of my life. Without that scientific proof of Rebecca's deception, I would have been legally and financially tied to her criminal activities and personal instability for decades. I would have been making child support payments that subsidized the lifestyle of a woman who'd betrayed me both personally and potentially legally. The 18 years of financial obligation I'd avoided by refusing to sign Emma's birth certificate represented not just money but freedom from continued entanglement in Rebecca's destructive choices. The DNA test had also protected me from potential legal exposure related to Rebecca's criminal activities. If I'd remained married to her during the period when she was participating in Pierce's fraud scheme, investigators might have examined my finances and activities as part of their investigation. My status as a divorced spouse with no legal connection to Emma had kept me peripheral to the criminal case, avoiding complications that could have affected my commercial driver's license and employment prospects. Sometimes the right decision protects you from consequences you can't even anticipate at the time. Jennifer and I had been talking more seriously about marriage as our relationship deepened and stabilized. The contrast between our honest, straightforward partnership and the deception that had characterized my marriage to Rebecca made me appreciate the value of authentic intimacy. Jennifer never made me guess at her feelings or motivations. She communicated directly about her needs and expectations, creating the kind of emotional safety that had been missing from my relationship with Rebecca. Building a life with someone who valued honesty and loyalty felt like emerging from years of confusion into clarity and peace. The wedding planning process with Jennifer was refreshingly simple and focused on what actually mattered for our future together. We weren't interested in elaborate ceremonies or expensive celebrations. Instead, we focused on creating legal and emotional bonds that would support a lifetime of partnership and mutual support. Jennifer's practical approach to major decisions complemented my own preference for substance over style, creating a planning process that strengthened our relationship rather than stressing it. As our wedding date approached, I found myself thinking less frequently about Rebecca and Emma, signs that I was genuinely moving forward rather than simply avoiding the past. The trauma of discovering Rebecca's betrayals had diminished from acute pain to manageable sorrow, the kind of sadness that accompanies any significant loss but doesn't prevent happiness or growth. Jennifer's love and partnership had created space for healing that allowed me to rebuild trust and optimism about intimate relationships. On our wedding day, surrounded by Jennifer's children and a small group of close friends, I felt genuine joy for the first time in years. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, focused on promises we intended to keep rather than performances for others' approval. Jennifer's vows were characteristically direct and heartfelt, expressing love and commitment without dramatic flourishes or empty romantic clichés. My own vows reflected lessons learned from the failure of my first marriage, emphasizing honesty, loyalty, and the kind of daily dedication that sustains long-term partnerships. The honeymoon Jennifer and I took was modest but perfect for our relationship. We spent a week in a cabin near Crater Lake, hiking during the day and cooking simple meals together in the evenings. The quiet intimacy of shared activities and conversation felt luxurious after years of complicated relationships and emotional turmoil. Jennifer's contentment with simple pleasures and genuine connection reminded me that happiness doesn't require drama or complexity. Sometimes the best relationships are built on ordinary moments of trust and affection rather than grand gestures or passionate intensity. Years passed quietly. Emma graduated high school with honors, earned a full scholarship to Arizona State University, and majored in social work. She never knew her anonymous benefactor's identity, only that someone believed in her potential when her own parents had failed her. Rebecca eventually found stability working at a nonprofit organization that helped formerly incarcerated individuals rebuild their lives. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Nathan Pierce served 8 years in federal prison and disappeared after release, never once attempting contact with his daughter. Linda passed away peacefully when Emma was 16, having lived long enough to see her granddaughter become a remarkable young woman despite impossible circumstances. Emma spoke at her funeral about the importance of second chances and the power of unconditional love. Jennifer and I watched from a distance as Emma built a successful career helping vulnerable children navigate the system that had once threatened her own stability. She married a fellow social worker and had 2 children of her own, breaking the cycle of dysfunction that had defined her early years. On Emma's wedding day, I received an unexpected letter. She had discovered my identity through her grandmother's papers and wanted to thank the man who had almost been her father for the opportunities that changed her life. Her words were gracious and mature, expressing gratitude without expectation of ongoing relationship. The letter concluded with a simple truth that brought closure to a chapter I thought would never end. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go, and sometimes the greatest gift is helping someone without needing recognition. Thank you for both. I showed the letter to Jennifer, who smiled with the wisdom of someone who understood that doing right doesn't always feel good in the moment but creates peace that lasts a lifetime. Rebecca's betrayal had cost me a marriage and dreams of fatherhood with Emma, but it had also led me to Jennifer and taught me the difference between love and manipulation, between trust and blind faith. Emma's success proved that children can overcome their parents' failures when given the right support and opportunities. Looking back, I realized that refusing to sign that birth certificate had been the most important signature I never gave. It protected me from years of deception while ultimately allowing me to help Emma in ways that truly mattered. Sometimes the hardest decisions create the most beautiful outcomes even when we can't see them at the time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.